me.
These are cicada killer wasps, common to the Americas. As the name implies, they are best known for displaying great feats of strength in preying on the unique true bug, the cicada, and less so for their ability to similarly utilise their strength in making a right mess as a digger wasp. They're pretty striking too, sporting a very intimidating livery that leaves an imprint in one's memory. Surely a wasp of this nature would hurt like hell if you were to get stung by it, right? At least that's what a lot of people expected to hear when they would ask Justin Schmidt. Justin was an entomologist, an insect scientist, and a passionate one at that. But when probed with this question by morbidly curious individuals, he didn't have any satisfactory answers. In fact, he had been working with these wasps for many years and had never been stung himself, and likewise couldn't remember any trusted account of someone getting stung by a cicada killer wasp either. Dissatisfaction consequently stemmed from the fact that he was the expert and he ought to have an answer. Naturally, to right this wrong in Justin's world, this meant to make himself a guinea pig at the next available moment, in which, instead of fetching for his trusty insect net, he would grab the wasp firmly in his hand and bang, receive its aggression. This was the seeding event of the mythology around Justin Schmidt, a scientist on a quest to better understand the different levels of wretched pain that insect stings could mete out to unwelcome limbs. And much like the naturalists of old, he wanted to index and categorize these events, create a reference resource regarding these insect stings, a tradition arguably started by the great Roman figure Pliny the Elder, who spent a significant portion of his time characterizing insect stings and bites in his Natural Histories. A personal favourite of mine being that for the treatment of spider bites, he recommended you could drink rooster's brains in vinegar, or swallow 5 ants, or apply sheep's dung in vinegar to the bite site. Quite an array of instructions there, Pliny old boy. This was completely in character for Justin. He had a tendency of using his own inbuilt biological sensors for testing the unknown. For example, he found himself at his computer one fine day with his concentration being drawn to a kingbird outside that was periodically looking left and right, zipping away off its branch. The bird would return with regularity, apparently chowing down on a bee each time, which seemed unexpected, as it looked like the bird had not manipulated its prey to avoid being stung. So surely it would be stung. And so why was it continuing to feast on these bees? Of course, Justin being aware that a generalist predator like humans and birds share a similar taste response, he had to go catch and chew on some bees. He did so and divided them in 3, based on their major structural elements: the head, the thorax with wings, and the abdomen. The head tasted of fingernail polish, the thorax a fairly unoffensive flavour, and the abdomen tasted like a harsh chemical solvent. This made sense based on the glands of the bee. The head produces potent pheromones near the mandible mouth parts, and the abdomen has venom and further large glands, which do not occur in the thorax. So why was it the kingbird gleefully consumed this repugnant meal? Well, much like Justin, the kingbird would spit out the hard shells of the bees after accessing their juicier parts, and by laying a sheet below the tree upon which it was perched, Justin could collect the receipts of kingbird's meals. By microscopically observing these regurgitated fragments, he confirmed that the bird was strictly consuming the rarer male bees. This astute animal had figured out a means to visually discern male from female bees, an excellent development, as these males do not develop the large glands and venom of the female, which makes them so unpalatable. Naturally, Justin was sure to follow up and report that the male bee tastes like custard. I suspect though not nearly as nice as, say, natas. So by now we've got a handle on the type of guy Justin was, and how much he values getting data. And his experience with the cicada killer wasp merely encouraged this side of him, due to the surprising result that the sting of that wasp didn't hurt all that much. In fact, it felt at most like getting hit with a thumbtack and didn't even produce the infamous burning sensation so associated with insect stings. It was, without doubt, a lot less painful than a honeybee sting, despite having a comparatively enormous stinger, and with that, a quest was started in earnest. Justin had come to the realization that there is a significant blind spot in human knowledge about stingers, in that humans were poorly assigning threat levels to insects, and that there lacked any comprehensive reference to correct this behaviour. So he would be the person to set about creating one. Additionally, it would fuel his own curiosity and theories on an insect by insect basis, because the construction of such a reference would likely yield some new insights. Firstly, from getting a global view of where all insect stings lie relative to each other. And also it was his firm belief that stingers and venom explain why a lot of insects develop socially. So understanding them helps to understand the evolution of hives and nests. To sharply convince you, he puts forward a great explanation in his book, The Sting of the Wild, which is just a wonderful read, by the way. He has a real comfortable passion in his writing. But back to his explanation. Insects are hard to catch. They're pretty small and they're not exactly nutrient dense. Large predators aren't really going to trouble themselves expending hard-earned energy harrying a meagre sole insect. However, if there are a bunch of insects living together, well now that balance is looking a lot better. A juicier prize for the effort. Likewise, for a sole insect, it's better to live among many siblings sharing your DNA. Odds are someone will hopefully find a goldmine of food, others will help to tend to the young, and if one individual is unfortunately killed, the bloodline doesn't end there. But those things conflict, of course. Insects are better off together, but predators are now very interested. As Justin describes, if you're sat on the couch and you're quite fond of eating some delicious salted peanuts, well, you're not going to get up off your butt for a bowl with a single peanut across the room. At least I hope not. But make that a whole bowl of peanuts and, well, you might now be inclined to sluggishly make an effort to go get them. In this setup, it'd be pretty good for the peanuts' survival if they could develop a repellent in the way of a stinger. But then again, they might just survive from our slothful preferences.
Nah.
It definitely should be noted too that Justin found joy in settings where threat and reality didn't add up and demanded explanation. Beginning in the 1980s and peaking in the 1990s, there was rampant mania surrounding what were labelled Africanized killer bees. It was all over the news. There were seemingly endless people trying to cash in on it with books, video games, toys, and low-budget films with the quintessential hilarious preface text. It even spiritually continues today, reaching new lows, or highs, depending on your proclivities. Where the 1980s was concerned with the future invasion of bees from South America, the 1990s spun news stories about the killer bees border crossing events, which somehow managed to be a little tamer than the border discussions we hear nowadays. Yes indeed, in the 90s, bees were the it insect. And honestly, who could foresee that pangolins would take the honours of hottest wildlife for the 2020s? The reality though, as is often the case, is that the insects and circumstances weren't anywhere near what had been whipped up by the media circus. These bees were a hybrid of a very much domesticated European honeybee and an African honeybee to generate a strain of bee that could be particularly productive in the climate of Brazil. They were successful to an extent too, and particularly later for pollinating large swathes of South American crops by conquering much of the continent after their inevitable escape from containment, wherein they certainly did make headlines for stinging humans along the way. All this background would stimulate the aforementioned hysteria around the unprecedented and unique threat to human civilization as we knew it. Justin was a small but key figure in grounding everybody, in so much as they can be anyway. He was a part of a study in 1989, right at the peak of killer bee mania, in which they captured 1,000 bees from Arizona and 1,000 Africanized bees from Costa Rica. They isolated and pooled the venom together to average it. For starters, they demonstrated that the Arizona bees actually carried quite a lot more venom than the Costa Rican ones, which were generally smaller anyway. Across tests in mice, they found that, if anything, Arizona bee stings were more lethal than the Africanized bees. Take, for example, in what are called C3H mice specifically, a dose of venom that would be considered lethal is 7.1 milligrams per kilo with the Africanized bees. But with the European bees, a lethal dose is 4.6 milligrams per kilogram. Combine that with the fact that European bees are carrying a good chunk more venom in general, getting stung with one is almost like getting stung by more than 2 Africanized bees. They themselves wrote, "We report such data and conclude by comparison with data from European bees that the mortality associated with Africanized honeybee attacks is primarily the result only of the number of stings. What really turned out to be the case in the end with Africanized bees is that they are simply more like a natural bee you would expect in the wild. When pottering about drinking nectar on a flower, they won't represent any more of a threat than the typical honeybee. The important element to be concerned with is that they have an elevated defensive behavior when you get close to their nest." Centuries of humans engaging in beekeeping meant we had progressively selected for bees that wouldn't be so tetchy when we approached a hive to steal their precious honey. Fittingly, they conclude their report with the words, "Perhaps use of the popular term killer bee to describe the Africanized bee is inappropriate." Their research was simple and hugely impactful. It was referenced across the globe and contributed its small part in turning the whole thing into a damp squib, kind of like the Y2K moment. And the passage of time has only reinforced their conclusions. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention regularly releases reports on the number of deaths from hornet, wasp and bee stings, and for the 2011 to 2021 period, a time, remember, in which Americans were predicted to be battling for their very existence, a total of 788 deaths from those insects occurred, with an average of 72 deaths per year. Quite a small average, which hasn't changed much at all from the 90s, with population growth accounted for. Not to mention, most of these stats likely come from single sting events rather than swarms of insects, where deaths will occur from allergic reactions most likely. Plus, and I don't mean to say that getting stung by many bees won't hurt like hell. It would absolutely, but it does take hundreds to thousands of bee stings to kill a human. And moreover, it's also likely that most of these recorded stings come from everyone's favourite garden friend, the common yellow jacket wasp, which are scavengers by nature. They are incapable of drinking nectar from quite a lot of flowers because they lack a long tongue, and tend to be more interested in human activities like barbecues and whether you'll finish drinking that can of Coke. So Justin was a man for hands-on experience to get to the bottom of things. This behaviour is what ultimately yielded the Schmidt Pain Index, which remains the de facto gospel on stinging pain to this day. An index is just an organised list of information, normally with measurements. Relatable examples being the infamous BMI and the quite helpful UV index. In this case, Schmidt Pain Index was composed by Justin using his many, many recent experiences in being stung or intentionally stinging himself at least once, with almost every stinging insect he came across to complete a comprehensive reference of how painful insect stings are relative to each other, all the while seeking independent accounts of people being stung to calibrate his own experiences. It's all very similar to the difficulty in accurately characterizing the day-to-day pain you may experience, like how sore your stomach might feel with an ache. You'll say something like, you feel like you're being stabbed to communicate that pain level.
Stab.
So perhaps it might surprise you that this index approach is pretty commonplace in medicine to this day, to use what on the surface seems like nebulous pain levels. A famous one being the McGill Pain Questionnaire and its variants. Constructed by Ron Melzack at the McGill University in the 1970s as a means to measure chronic pain from patient accounts and the clinical team's evaluation of facial expressions and body language. The man himself was the first to admit it was an imperfect tool, but it was widely adopted and continues to be utilized in its many forms today. By establishing his own reference list like Ron, if someone then asked Justin what a cicada killer wasp sting felt like, he'd be able to give a helpful and as relatable an answer as he could. He would have said it's nothing like a honeybee sting and almost doesn't register as in any way painful. And he knew others agreed. He'd give it a Schmidt Pain Index value of 0.5, which is decidedly less painful than a honeybee sting, which would come in at a pain level of 2 on the index. The true emergence of the pain index occurred with a very cleverly written article by Justin and his colleagues called The Hemolytic Activities of Stinging Insect Venoms, which means the ability of an insect venom to burst blood cells. I say cleverly written, and I don't want to disparage their efforts either, as it's a great bit of work, but equipped with the background knowledge we've discussed, you would rightly wonder why the title doesn't allude at all to some sort of stinging pain index. It's only when reading deeper into the text that they carefully say that the hemolytic activities don't correlate with the algogenicity, a nice technical term for saying the ability of something to cause pain. I greatly suspect they were very careful, in some regard, in putting out their work of how badly things hurt when stinging themselves, and so they did so in a way that was innocuous, so as to not ruffle any feathers from party poopers who might seek to block it from publication, of which there will always be many, I can assure you of that. In this bit of work, they describe how they took equal amounts of venom from 21 insect species and individually added them all to tubes containing mouse blood. They would then incubate them and wait to see how each venom performed in bursting open blood cells, which is a way of testing how toxic they are and is easy to measure as a kind of colour change. Sounds sensible and reliable, but bursting blood cells isn't where pain comes from. It's certainly a hugely important destructive toxic element of venoms, but pain is something separate, murky. Because pain response relates to stimulation of complex nerve receptor cell networks that can't exactly be extracted for study or replicated with great fidelity, it is not easily measured even with modern day means.
Ew.
This is why, after describing their blood-bursting tests, they also then stated painfulness of venoms to humans was evaluated subjectively, mainly by the authors, to natural stings. Whenever possible, the ratings were also corroborated by testimony of other persons. Now, normally that would be an immediate and serious alarm bell. You're measuring something on yourself with your own genetic bias, giving them so-called ratings like a film review and asking others what they thought also. But as mentioned above, for current clinical evaluations of pain, it's still a pretty good indicator if you're careful about how you draw those lines on your rankings. And it really is a bit like, say, IMDb ratings. There will be plenty of erroneous ratings if you manage to get some morsel of objectivity in play to rate things, but as a whole, it sets a decent ballpark to get a gauge on things initially. And Better Call Saul is definitely at least a 9. In this particular article, Justin didn't specifically divulge how he constructed his pain index. He just wrote it was a relative scale from 1 to 4, but it would flesh out over the coming years and he would explain the parameters at other opportunities, like in his book. He laid out that a useful scale would need to be reliable, reproducible with ranges from 0 to 4 and anchored by the honeybee sting at a pain level of 2. He chose the honeybee in this central role as he felt because they were abundant across the globe, most people would have been stung by them more so than anything else that people could relate to. And also for the reason that they are naturally a midpoint between the range of stings. They are painful but neither insignificant or extremely painful. Implicitly, 0 exists on the list as a dud rating, where insects with stingers are incapable of penetrating human skin. The criteria for assigning the pain scale level is that the lower level is substantially less painful than the level above it, and a person who was stung would easily be able to say that one sting hurt more than the other. Pair that with a previous incident, a memory of being stung by something else as a comparison, say a honeybee, and one could begin to assign ratings. In some cases, halfway values like 1.5 are used when pain is distinctly stronger than the lower level, but distinctly less painful than the higher level. He wanted to stress as well that insects assigned the same pain level did not necessarily produce an identical feeling from their sting. They just existed within the same pain and deterrent range a hungry predator would encounter. Orange and apple juice don't taste the same, but they're sweet drinks when compared to carrot juice. I have to mention as well that despite the intense study of insects by humans, nobody really paid attention to the fact that pain and the damage that insect venoms cause are separate events that dictate the life experience of the insect. They don't necessarily correlate, and they don't need to correlate. It's simply whatever balance the insect species has evolved in a hostile world. Their conclusion is that there is no definite correlation between how toxic a venom is, i.e. its ability to cause damage, to how painful the sting is. In other words, the venom ingredients that cause pain and those that are toxic are not necessarily the same thing or required together. A great example of this is the undoubtedly striking velvet ant. The red velvet ant, or cow killer as it's commonly called, is actually a family of parasitic solitary wasp. But one could be forgiven for thinking it was an ant because the long-lived wingless female resembles one scuttling across the ground in broad daylight. Yet, unlike ants, and as the velvet name suggests, it sports a striking aposematic coat or hairy warning signal that tells you back the hell away from me. I'm nothing but bad news. It also has a rock-hard shell that is reinforced by mineral accumulation and a few other defense mechanisms that have earned it the moniker of the indestructible insect. For example, it's clear that they are also highly noxious or unpalatable. Basically, they taste absolutely horrendous. In addition to being unpleasant to chew on, their stinger makes them an awful choice of food for predators. There's a study that emphasises this that I find hilarious because it tests a whole range of would-be natural predators and finds that the only one that would eat them is the voracious but generally simple-minded toad. Out of 100 tests with reptiles, mammals, birds and amphibians, the only thing to actually eat a juicy cow killer when presented with one was, and I quote, a single American toad, who twitched and appeared dead about 30 minutes after eating them, with breathing ceased and mouth gaped, but survived no problem in the end, and said no thank you when offered another one 1 week later. So maybe not so simple-minded after all. The response of the rest of the predators to the velvet ant also helps in understanding the value in that aposematic side of animals in general too. That conspicuous warning label they strut around in that causes avoidance in predators and is something that other insects seek to mimic. And isn't it better to advertise that you are not a trivial meal without needing to engage and utilise your precious armaments?
Oi!
It probably won't surprise you to hear then that Justin himself had also tested the taste aspect of cow killers, as again, he would have a similar taste receptor response as the toad. He chewed on one for 2 seconds and then spat it out. The taste, in his words, was stunning. What remained with him for about an hour after was an incredibly bitter and corrosive burning sensation that attacked the back of his throat. All this aside, the primary fixation about the cow killer is its stinger, which, like the cicada killer, is enormous and nearly half the size of its body. But unlike the cicada killer wasp, the larger species of velvet ant you typically find across North America back up this impressive stinger with a caustic haymaker of a punch. Justin describes it as explosive and long-lasting. You sound insane as you scream. Hot oil from the deep fryer spilling over your entire hand. And according to Justin, the velvet ant lands a solid 3 on the pain scale. So their sting sounds horrendous, right? But here's the wrinkle. In Justin's own experiments, the extracted fluid from the cow killer sting can barely burst blood cells and cause any damage. In toxicity terms, the velvet ant is a dud. Amazingly, he found that a honeybee sting is about 25 times more toxic than stings from these large cow killers. Based on his own measurements of how much venom you can extract from a honeybee and a velvet ant, under the perfect stinging conditions, you could expect a single honeybee to represent a genuine lethal threat to a mouse, but you would need close to 5 for a velvet ant for a similar level of concern. For a velvet ant to kill a cow? Well, if you do the calculations based on Justin's findings, where you require 71 milligrams of velvet ant venom per kilogram of animal for it to reach lethal levels, and say we have a lean cow coming in at 500 kilograms, then you would need 35.5 grams of velvet ant venom, or say the same weight as 3 AAA batteries, to represent a lethal threat to a cow under great stinging conditions. From Justin's harvesting, you get about 0.42 milligrams of dry weight venom from a velvet ant, meaning that you'd need about 85,000 velvet ants to sting a cow for it to die from venom toxicity. So, hilariously, this thing is neither an ant nor a cow killer. Overall, it would appear that this unusual species of wasp hadn't the need to evolve toxic venoms. Instead, it had simply mastered the art of pain. Like other pain-inducing wasps, it had a hefty amount of serotonin in its venom, instead of a chunk of damage-inducing toxins like the honeybee. And yes, that's right, serotonin, that mood-altering neurotransmitter, leads a double life where well-being is concerned. Serotonin is produced by cells from the very basic ingredient of tryptophan, one of the amino acids, and velvet ants make this exact biochemical too. If you have prolonged elevation of serotonin in your brain, you're probably feeling contented. It's actually how some antidepressants work, by trying to keep it elevated. However, some of the very same serotonin receptors that are in your brain also exist at the end of your nerves around your body. If a velvet ant stings you, it injects serotonin into your skin. It interacts with these serotonin receptors, which function as pain receptors here instead. In the receptor, it's made up of 5 building blocks. With each block, there exists a place in which serotonin can bind. The more serotonin that binds to these 5 places, the more it will alter the receptor. It will distort the whole structure in a way that will cause the receptor to open a channel to your nerve. This causes a massive influx of calcium and sodium into your nerves, which causes a sudden burst of electricity that signals to your brain that you are in pain. But hauntingly, stings like that of the velvet ant completely flood your receptors. They will occupy all 5 sites on a huge number of receptors and immediately flood your nerves with that electrical surge telling your brain that you are essentially on fire. Lovely stuff. The cow killer, the velvet ant, this wasp, just needs a single painful sting full of serotonin along with its other defenses to cause a predator to drop it from its mouth and let it escape among the terrain. Job done. It didn't need to defend some sort of stationary hive, to the extent that it would have needed to develop toxic means to incapacitate predators, because hunger is a tremendous driving force and animals could learn to endure painful stings when no real damage will occur for a huge prize like a honeycomb. A great example then of an animal with similar environments but different demands to the velvet ant is the harvester ant, a real ant this time. It's quite a gentle giant of the ant world too, all things considered. A very docile, unbothered ant most typically found in southern areas of the United States where, as their name suggests, they'll likely be harvesting for seeds. Where the velvet ant walks a lonesome road, surviving by advertising danger and equipped to flee from the jaws of defeat, the harvester ant has an impressive, long-lasting and difficult to relocate colony to protect, especially in exposed and seemingly barren places where meals are hard to come by for potential predators. To give all of that some perspective, it wouldn't be highly unusual if a harvester ant colony was found out in the middle of the Arizona deserts at an age of at least 40 years old and reaching a depth of nearly 4 meters into the ground, or about the size of an elephant. Which, incidentally, is very helpful for the aeration of soil for nearby plants. They are in fact widely believed to be the longest living ant colonies we're aware of. Kathleen Keeler in Nebraska went to some effort to prove as such, tracking 56 harvester ant species colonies from the 1970s to the 1990s, finding that, after 15 years, about 70% of colonies were still going strong. Thus, extrapolating that trend to more than 40 years will show at least some colonies surviving. Surely these qualified as treasured nests full of legacy and to be protected by their inhabitants. These ants were a favourite of Justin's. He was pretty much a world expert in their stings. His attention had initially been directed to them due to being assigned the task of studying their poorly characterised defences for his graduate school work. And on his first field trip to collect some specimens, he then became transfixed with them due to the reaction to their sting. A genuine rarity in the ant and stinging insect world, the harvesters do have a true stinger that can become detached from its body and keep injecting venom like a honeybee, referred to as sting autotomy. He and his partner both got stung by harvester ants, and he was captivated by the fact that it was completely unlike the hot burning pain he had been accustomed to with his childhood stinging events. He recorded an account of the feeling they had, saying that the sting produced a deep ripping and tearing pain, as if someone were reaching below the skin and ripping muscles and tendons, except the ripping continued with each crescendo of pain. In essence, it feels like the ant rips your arm off. He recounted that they were in continual pain for 4 hours, which only evaporated at the 8th hour. Much like the velvet ant, the pain would score a very high 3 on the index. But the reaction to the harvester ant had deeper levels of fascination, for at the sting site it caused his hairs to stand up on end, as would happen with a frightened animal, and the area became moist with sweat. Truly an incredible concoction had been injected into his arm, one that mesmerised him so much he refers to this event in time as love at first sting. Where Justin saw lifelong passion unfold before him, others historically likely saw horror. Accounts from several sources throughout the many years have reported that natives of the American landmass utilised harvester ant mounds as places of torture. They would supposedly be used sometimes as a challenge of one's manhood, or a method of interrogation, or to extinguish their enemies in a sea of pain and anaphylaxis. Binding their victims to the mounds and aggravating the colony to attack the restrained persons was the name of the game. Safe to say, some deaths are worse than others. Sometime after his first encounter with their sting, Justin would greatly bolster the credentials of the harvester ant sting by performing studies on their isolated venom. In the Maricopa species of harvester ant, he found that their venom likely qualifies them as a contender for the most toxic insect venom in the world, weighing in at a toxicity that is some 20 times more toxic than the honeybees, and pound for pound more toxic than most snake venoms. For starters, the harvester ant venom is generally highly hemolytic, meaning it rapidly bursts blood cells. The amounts involved looks like this. Imagine you have a 1 litre bottle of liquid where 5% of the solution is made up of whole red blood cells in suspension. If you dropped a sesame seed worth of venom into that bottle, that is the equivalent amount of Florida harvester ant venom needed to burst all cells inside. This activity was due to a key protein factor in the venom that Justin himself and his team discovered. They named it barbitolizin, after the Latin name for the red harvester ant. It's not too dissimilar in outcome to honeybee venom protein as I've talked about before, but chemically very different as it appears to act more so like a soap, a detergent. In the same way dishwashing soap can lead to the dissolving of fats, barbitolizin appears to act in a very similar way on blood cells. In a small animal like a mouse, enough harvester ant venom can quickly become a fatal problem from barbitolizin alone, because the kidneys would quickly become overwhelmed, getting clogged up from the extensive damage to blood cells. Next up is the more worrisome fact that the venom also contains neurotoxins. Under perfect sting conditions where the venom escapes past the skin quickly, small predators of the ant are at serious risk of death. For example, you only require about 0.005 milligrams of harvester ant venom to cause a fatal reaction in small rodents, which is only the mass of a very fine speck of sand. This is largely attributed to not one, but several neurotoxin peptides in the ant's venom. These little proteins would bind to and jam open electrical channels on your nerve cells to cause them to continually fire electrical signals, not too dissimilar to serotonin and its receptors. Justin and his team discovered them and confirmed their activity in the Maricopa harvester ant by isolating the venom and using various identifying techniques to determine the nature of each component, giving each of them a name from PMA 1 to 7. And here's a pretty cool bit of detail. There was a specificity to their actions. Why would the ant have several of these PMA neurotoxins in its venom? Surely 1 or 2 would do the job. Well, if you take the PMA1 and PMA2 neurotoxins from this whole cocktail, these can cause nerve firing, pain and swelling in mammals like humans and mice, but PMA3 to 6 will do diddly squat. Conversely, if you inject a fly with PMA1 and 2, it won't do anything, but the fly will likely be paralysed by PMA3 to 6, with irreversible paralysis from PMA5 and 6. Out exposed in the seemingly barren landscape for all to see and prey on it, the ant had evolved a Swiss Army knife of peptides to inject into a variety of enemies, all tailored to their particular nervous system and all enabling long-lasting painful reactions to defend the colony. Although large species of velvet ants and harvester ants are coming in at a high 3 on the pain scale, the harvester ant is the outlier of the two because of its species. When Justin compiled this index, it was extremely helpful in contributing to understanding what the pain level meant for each insect in terms of its survival. As was mentioned before, it also helped to give a bit of a global view of stinging insects in general. And if you were to make a generalization from it, then the majority of ants aren't really that painful in their stinging efforts, usually coming in at an average pain level closer to 1 to 1.5, with some strong outlier species. Then most bees are slightly more painful and tightly clustered around a pain level of 1 to 2. And finally wasps, keeping up with their infamous reputation in general, are the most painful stinging insects, with an average pain level of 2 and skewed upwards in general towards producing more painful stings. So yes, if you had a bit of a bias towards wasps being a menace, then you are probably correct. But don't let appearances deceive. Some ants like the bullet and harvester ant are truly awful to be stung by, and some wasps are sheep in wolf's clothing. But go take a look for yourself. I don't want to spoil all the fun of going through the many examples. Please check out the scale when you get a chance and bask in Justin's attempts to communicate the stinging experience. like how he equates the painful sting of a jack jumper ant to the feeling like your oven mitt had a hole in it when taking the cookies out of the oven. Or how the almost harmless sting of a sweat bee is light and ephemeral, almost fruity. These seemingly inexhaustible and comprehensive first-hand accounts of so many stinging insects are the reason why he was widely dubbed the King of the Sting.
Yeah.
Finally, I'd like to end on the fact that Justin's work on the index continues to inspire like-minded people. He himself was aware that the pain level experienced could vary considerably based on where you were stung. He approached that issue by using an average. For example, if he was aware a sting hurt far more on, say, your leg than on your hand, he would assign values based on an average of the two. But in his graduate studies, a budding sting pain expert, Michael Smith of Cornell, took keen interest in Justin's explanations of sting site variations, where Justin recorded a sting experience wherever it may have occurred, as the chips landed, so to speak. Michael set about systematically determining the locations on the human body where a honeybee sting would hurt the most. More specifically, Michael was going to make a body part pain index for honeybee stings. In random order, totaling 25 locations across his body, he captured a bee each time from the same hive and would allow it to sting him for 1 minute and recorded the pain level from 1 to 10. To control for variation and get an accurate index, he repeated each body part 3 times and used a sting on the forearm as the median pain level, a standard and the center point for the scale. Now, as you might imagine, things get a little interesting pretty quickly as you're going through the body parts. And before you need to ask, yes, this madman did indeed sting his nether regions in several areas. Hell, he even drew in the nipples. And to think I was already wincing when reading he planned to sting his lips and nose. He also included an unintentionally hilarious line of text in his paper stating, "Some locations required the use of a mirror and an erect posture during stinging, e.g. buttocks." It might surprise you to find out that getting stung on the tip of your toes or skull doesn't really hurt all that much, and that the nostril is the worst place to get stung. I know. Less surprising, perhaps, is that the butt can take a good old stinging. However, if you're male, your meat and veg are probably going to take a right battering around bees. On that note, that's it folks. Take care now, and slán a bhaile.